You didn't! Elrohir caught on before Aragorn could speak. I did. The human stifled a giggle as he glanced at the eldest twin. You used the warring technique I taught you? Eladon stared in surprise at the younger ranger. Aragorn laughed slightly and admitted his actions. Yes, he ate a bite of food while he let them hang on his words, eyes twinkling with merriment. And it worked. Elrohir laughed out loud. You didn't. What poor unwitting soul did you do that to? Me, Legolas answered, embarrassment tinging his fair cheeks a light crimson. I was unaware that he had been thus taught. He looked accusingly at Eladon. Eladon's eyes darkened. You tried it on a royal? Elrohir hadn't stopped laughing, and the new information caused him to laugh even harder as he choked on the food he had been eating. What am I going to do with you? Eladon stared at the young man in utter surprise. Aragorn stifled a laugh and shrugged. The totally innocent look on the man's face started Legolas laughing as well. I didn't think it would really work. He tried to defend himself. At the lame excuse, Eladon dropped his head into his hands. I give up. Shaking his head in utter amazement, he muttered, Oh, just wait until Father hears about this. You can't tell him. Aragorn leaned across the dining table, whispering his words frantically. We are so sorry. Elrohir apologized to the elf prince, trying to contain his laughter. He was truly all right. Legolas had finally restrained himself and gotten his breathing under control. The whole situation between the brothers had been enormously entertaining. Hey! Aragorn gave Elrohir a shove at the apology. All eyes turned towards the human. It worked. He emphasized each word as though his statement had not yet sunk in. The excitement on his face sent Elrohir back into a fit of laughter. Helplessly, Aragorn glanced at Legolas for support. Oh, it did. The elf rubbed his jaw for emphasis. Eladon threw his hands in the air. What have I told you? Do you never listen to me? This time Aragorn couldn't suppress his own laughter as Legolas gently cuffed him upside the head, eliciting a thank you from the eldest twin. Thranduil had been watching the conversation with growing interest and spoke up, addressing his son. Is this something I should know of? The Rivendell twins glanced at Legolas, startled. Aragorn's possession of secret elven knowledge was not something that was commonly known. It might not be well understood by elves outside of Rivendell. No, Father, it's nothing, I assure you. Legolas glanced at the ranger out of the corner of his eye. Eladon leaned across the table and growled at the human in a low whisper. Do not do that again, unless it's absolutely necessary. Elrohir chimed in his muttered warning. Not to worry, Aragorn replied with disappointment. They won't let me. At this, both Elrohir and Legolas erupted into laughter. Elrohir, you're not helping things, Eladon chastised his sibling. Having enough of the younger one's antics, Thranduil spoke up. Eat! The food's getting cold. His deep booming voice silenced the youthful giggles, and the room returned to a peaceful silence once more. Aragorn glanced quickly at Legolas. The elf smiled back and nodded his head. Things were all right. It was good to have them all here for the evening. Chapter 2. Rumbles of Discontent. Aragorn was enjoying himself. His brothers had left a few days ago, after spending the remainder of the week with him here at Lord Thranduil's estate. They had set out for home to return to their father with word of Aragorn. He had wished them well and sent a letter back to Elrond with them. The ranger had decided to remain in Mirkwood for a few more weeks. It had been agreed between Legolas, the twins, and himself that Aragorn's true identity would not be made known to the other elves at this time, but would remain a secret between the prince and the ranger. The others would continue to know the Dunedain only as Strider. His leg was feeling almost normal again, and he had decided to go for a walk in the immediate area surrounding Thranduil's castle. The prince had accompanied his father on business to the north of the woods, and had promised the younger ranger he would be back in the early afternoon. The castle and the grounds were spacious, and it had taken the better part of the morning to explore them. But the woodlands beckoned him now, and Aragorn was ready to be outdoors. He walked idly through the woods, listening to the sounds, pinpointing groups of elves as they walked and talked nearby. He heard the shuffle of horses as they grazed in the broad plains to the east of the king's mansion. The songs of birds lifted to the heavy warm air, and the safety and peace of the free wood settled like a blanket on the young human. His attention was dulled, and he simply enjoyed himself as he walked, blocking out all else but his own thoughts. Without warning, an arrow shot by his face, startling him with its proximity as it slammed into a tree on his left, burying its head in the thick trunk. He ducked involuntarily, almost losing his balance. Whirling on his heels, Aragorn turned back to the path the arrow had taken, and was faced with a dozen elves, bows raised and arrows notched. He recognized Sarkalion in their midst, but the elf's smile was anything but kind. Legolas had introduced Aragorn to Sarkalion some time ago, but the other elf did not seem over-fond of the young human, and they had not had much to do with one another. Slowly, Aragorn stood from his crouched position. "Oh, so sorry," called out an unfamiliar elf standing next to Sarkalion. "I did not see you there." The elves near him snickered quietly at the condescending tone of the bowman. A thrill of fear ran down Aragorn's spine, but he ignored it. He wouldn't let these elves know how they'd startled him. He remembered the warnings of Elrond before he had left. "Not all elves will look upon you kindly." This must have been the response his adopted father had foreseen from the residents of Mirkwood. The young ranger decided to respond kindly, and only nodded in answer, his half-smile belying the fact that he had been taken off guard, and was more than a little unsettled by the welcome he was receiving. "Could you be so good as to grab that arrow for me?" the elf asked. His courage returned some. Perhaps it truly had been an accident, and they hadn't seen him. Inside he knew it wasn't true, but he wanted to believe it, and so he complied. The ranger turned back to the tree, and, placing one hand against the trunk, pulled the arrow from where it had become embedded. "Like a good boy," the elf continued. Aragorn froze, one hand on the tree, one hand on the arrow shaft. His face turned away from the laughing elves. For a moment he seriously considered stringing the arrow on his own bow and sending it back to its owner. He knew better than to react in kind. Instead, closing his eyes tightly against the sneering and jests, Aragorn took a deep breath and simply turned around, walking the arrow back to the elf and placing it carefully in the upturned palm. "Now run along," another elf taunted him. "We can't have the prince's pet getting hurt in bow practice, now can we?" Aragorn had continued to casually walk past the group when the jest had been thrown at him. His anger got the best of him, and he spun back towards his tormentor. Sarkalion jumped forward and slammed the young ranger against the nearest tree, pinning him in place with his forearm. Aragorn's head impacted hard with the trunk, and he stifled a cry as he glared up into the tall elf's gray eyes. "Let it go, human." Sarkalion spoke the word like a slur it was meant to be. He grabbed Aragorn by the coat, pulling him away from the tree, and shoved the ranger back towards the palace. The man stumbled, catching himself on his hand before he fell. The fear showed in his eyes, and the sense of betrayal that beat at his heart and mind was foreign emotion. His father had been right. Secretly, in his heart, he believed that all elves were his brothers. He couldn't have been more wrong, and the ones standing over him were eager to prove his doubts right. The sound of horses' hooves on the dirt path caught the elves' attention, and they turned back towards the simple road that cut through the woods. The prince, passing through on his way back home, had recognized the elves and seen Aragorn in their midst. He reined in his mount and let his gaze fall over the silent group. Legolas locked eyes with Aragorn, who looked away quickly, shame burning like a fire in their dark depths. The exchange was not lost on the elf warriors, and they looked down in discomfort as the prince pierced each one of them with a knowing glance. "What is going on here?" More mounted elves joined the prince as the king's entourage caught up with the young elf lord. It was Aragorn who answered Legolas. "Nothing, my lord." His words fell fast and tumbled out a little too quickly. "We were simply having a conversation." The ranger's eyes were cast down to avoid the stares of the elves around him. Aragorn's gaze flicked quickly onto the prince before dropping back to the forest floor. Without another word, the human turned and walked off into the woods. When he was out of sight of the elves, the young ranger ran through the forest, heading away from the palace and away from his first encounter with people he thought he had belonged to. He was too proud to admit his heart was broken, and he wished to be near no one for a while. He had to think. He had to be alone. Legolas pinned Sarkalion with an even stare as Thranduil rode past and called the prince to join him. "We will talk later." With that caution, the elf spurred his horse after the retreating royals.